Yay, thank you for the lovely intro, Luke.
You're welcome.
The very first time that's happened, and I appreciate it. So today, welcome back to another episode of the Sad Dad Games podcast. We are doing an episode of Eric's Indie Corner. I am your host today, Eric. I'm joined by...
I'm Shan.
I'm Luke.
All right, and today we are going to be talking about a game called Panzer Paladin, which is one that I've been excited about. I've been saving it. This is one that I go back to and I play quite a bit. If I have a few minutes, it's like comfort food for me. I really like this game. So, Panzer Paladin, it is a single-player 2D action platformer in the style of older NES games. It is developed by a studio called Tribute Games. It came out on Windows and Switch on July 2020, and then a whopping 4 years later on Xbox and PS4. So there's a big gap in those. It just barely came out on well, not barely, but fairly recently on Xbox and PS4. And then for those of you who have been listening to all of the Eric's Indie episodes, which I know that you have because you love indie games as much as I do, so obviously you've listened to every episode. But the very first episode that we did was about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, and this is the same studio. Tribute Games developed that game, and they developed this game as well. So big fan of Tribute Games. And we here at Eric's Indie Corner going to break down this game by talking about the story. We're going to talk about the gameplay, and then we're going to talk about visuals and sound. All right, so kicking it off with story. The story in this game is mostly fairly simple because it kind of harkens back to the older NES style of games, but what's there is still pretty enjoyable. So you play as an android, a rescue service android named Flame, who I don't know why they made her an android because she looks and acts like a person, but she is an android. So you play as a rescue android named Flame, and she pilots a huge mech named Grit. And then Flame and Grit work together as a peacekeeping force to defend Earth from all threats. And then one day, a bunch of crazy weapons start raining from the heavens and causing monsters to come out of the Earth and attack the Earth. And so it's up to Flame and Grit to take these weapons and fight these monsters and figure out what's happening to Earth. And something that I thought was interesting about this game is that it's set on actual Earth. Like the levels are all in different countries. Like the intro level is in Canada, and then you visit Scotland and New York, and they're like all actual real places, which I thought was kind of cool. But yeah, the story is a lot of fun. It very much feels like kind of an 80s anime style cartoon. It's got the kind of Saturday morning cartoon vibes of 80s anime, which I think is fun. And, you know, everyone has the big poofy 80s anime hair, which is fun.
Yes.
And it's a good time. Story is sort of silly, not super crazy, but it's enjoyable. And it's a good set piece to facilitate the action gameplay.
So my first initial thoughts about the artwork, looking at Grit, right? He reminds me of like old school Gundam.
Yep.
He very much looks like a Gundam suit or like a mech warrior. He also, and this might be a weird reference, but did you ever play the SNES Power Rangers games? When you get in the Megazord, he super looks like the Megazord from Power Rangers. I don't know if that's like a reference.
He does kind of have Megazord vibes. I mean, I watched Power Rangers as a kid. I didn't play the Super Nintendo game, but yeah, he does kind of look like the Megazord.
Yeah, and like the way he slashes his weapon, it seems and looks really similar to that. But I love the artwork. There's something super nostalgic about it. Like this is the kind of thing I could have wasted a lot of time at the Nickelcade playing.
Yep.
Yeah. I love the crunchy alliterative name, Panzer Paladin. Like nobody really knows what either of those two names mean, but like put together, the words both mean like a Panzer is like a German war tank from World War II, and a Paladin is like a knight, so it's like a tank knight.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tank knight. Well, thank you for the etymology. I had no idea what Panzer meant until this moment. So
Yeah. It's a fantastic name. They
I'm
did
good
their
at
research.
history. Yeah. So I agree with that. I think it's a good punchy name, and it is very descriptive of what the game is you're a giant mech, basically. But I guess this leads pretty well into the gameplay. So what I like about this gameplay is it's not so much like unlike a tank, you're not really using projectile weapons. It's a very melee focused game. So this plays into the story. All of the weapons were raining down from the sky, which means that there are like hundreds of different kinds of weapons everywhere. And Grit can pick up those weapons and use them. And all of the weapons have different stats. They have different, strength and durability and all this stuff, which leads me to it's a very interesting system of how all of this kind of works together. So you can pick up weapons, you can use that weapon. They all have a durability meter. And if once the durability meter runs out, then the weapon will break. But if you want, you can intentionally break the weapon. And each weapon has a unique kind of a spell or something attached to it. Like some of them will heal you. Some of them will give you like your weapon swings a projectile. Some of it might give you a shield. And so different kinds of weapons all have different, like a magical spell that it'll cast, or you can throw the weapon to deal extra damage. Yeah, so there's lots of different kinds of weapons and things that you can do with those weapons. And like I always found myself really hoarding the healing weapons, because if I was in a sticky situation, I could bust out like 4 swords and just break all of them. And instead of being able to use a powerful sword as an attack weapon, I used it as a healing item. And so it gives you this balance of like, how do you want to use this weapon? Do you want to use it to heal? Do you want to use it to fight?
Do you have
so it's very cool.
Do you have a limited inventory? Like, is there a limited number of weapons you can?
So you can have 4 weapons like equipped so that you can cycle through them with the bumper buttons, but it's a limitless inventory. And so you can have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of weapons, which leads you into the next cool system that I feel like, because you're like, I don't need hundreds of weapons. This is too many weapons. But in between levels, you can go back to your home base and you can recycle weapons to use them. Like each weapon has a point value, and you can use those weapons to, if you discard them, you'll get that many points towards unlocking your next little upgrade to your health bar. And so you can sacrifice all of your extra weapons to upgrade your health, which I thought was a cool way to help you kind of get rid of some of the extra weapons that you have, but not make them useless. Like I have all these extra weapons that I don't need.
Because watching the gameplay, I was confused, like why he keeps whacking his weapons into the wall to break them.
Yep.
I was like, I don't know if that's helpful or if you have really limited inventory, so you're constantly breaking stuff on purpose, but that makes a lot of sense. That's a cool system.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it. It added an extra layer of complexity to a game that is on the surface pretty simple. You kind of just walk around and you jump and you slash your weapon and you fight bad guys. And the levels are all very linear. It's like start here, go there. There's not a lot of exploration in the levels. It's mostly just point A to B. So it added an extra layer of complexity, which I enjoyed.
Do you almost exclusively play as Grit, as the mech, or are there sections that you're playing as Flame?
I'm glad that you mentioned that. At any time, you can jump out of Grit by pushing a button. You jump out of Grit, and then you can run around as Flame. And Flame is very much a glass cannon. She can do just about as much damage as Grit, but her health bar is like 10% the size of Grit's. And so if you get out of Grit, you're much more vulnerable, but you can reach smaller areas. So there are some times where it's like there's a really small like pathway that Grit can't fit through, so you can jump out as Flame and go that way. And it'll often have like a little, like it'll have a health canister for Grit. So you can get that. And if you're low on health, you can jump out as Flame and go get that health canister. Or there are some parts of the level. In each level, there is at least one part where you have to get out and play a small part as Grit, or play a small part as Flame, I mean. So I thought that was a nice little way to mix it up. And Flame has slightly unique gameplay. She's got a whip that she can hit in front of her, but that there are like certain grappling points that you can grapple onto and use to swing. So she's got some more platforming challenges than Grit does, which is fun. So a nice way to keep the gameplay fresh. And also, if your health bar as Grit, if it drops to 0, then Flame will jump out and you have kind of like a last ditch effort to finish whatever you were doing as Flame without Grit, which in boss battles is particularly can be really... There was a couple of times where I thought that I was done. Grit dies, and you're like, oh shoot, I have to finish the battle as Flame, and you're a lot more vulnerable. But it adds this extra layer of tension and kind of this feeling of like, this is my last chance. I got to do it, kind of a thing. So that was a lot of fun.
Does like, is Grit purely a suit that Flame wears, or does Grit have like their own AI? Are they their own character?
As far as the story goes, I don't remember Grit ever talking or having
Okay.
like it's really just kind of a suit that Flame wears. So
Okay.
yeah, he's the Panzer Paladin. The level structure is also really interesting. It has a similar kind of a setup as Mega Man, with an exception. So Mega Man, you start a game, and there are like you can pick from 8 different levels or 6 or however many levels are in the game. You can pick which ones you want to do first, and you can do them in any order. And it's the same way here. It drops you onto the world map, and you can go, I want to go to Scotland, or I want to go to Egypt, or I want to go to, and you can do the levels in any order that you want, which I thought was kind of cool. And then once you do that cluster of levels, then you have, similar to Mega Man, you have like several more challenging end game levels, and to that kind of lead up to the end. So it's got a very Mega Man style structure that way, with the exception that Mega Man, there's like a right order to do the levels in, because it's like, I get this power up that makes this level easier, and then I get this power up that makes this level easier. And that doesn't exist in Panzer Paladin. You just kind of do the levels in whatever order you want to do them in. And so I thought that was a nice little level of freedom, because there was one level that was giving me a lot of difficulty, and I was like, screw it, I'm going to come back later. And so I just went and I did some other levels, and then I could come back to that one when my blood pressure was a little lower.
And it keeps your checkpoints, like you didn't have to start the whole thing over.
No, I had to start that whole level over,
bummer.
but it's like at a certain point, you got to cut your losses. And the levels aren't super duper long either. They're like 5, maybe 10 minutes. So you're not losing tons of progress. Yeah.
I think this is like an interesting trade-off that we've had to go through in the last decade or two of game design, where we've definitely decided that autonomy of choice is more important to a player. So we've decided it's more important that we're not put on rails. We want player choice to go and do whatever we want. We don't want the same experience every time. So in this, you were saying on Mega Man, we don't want to go in a straight line every time point A to B. And so for this, it's like, okay, we're inspired by Mega Man, but we want to be able to go in any direction we want. But the trade-off there is technically the difficulty curve has to stay flat the entire game.
Yeah. And there are some levels that are definitely harder, but it is a little more evened out at the beginning. But then you do have once you finish that cluster of levels, you have your end game levels, which ramp up pretty significantly. So,
okay. So they do have a way to figure that out, where it's like, okay, but there is still like a bucket of levels you play, and then there's a difficulty spike after you finish that. Okay.
Yeah, and those like some of the, and I'm pretty good at 2D platformers. I'm not like a prolific speed runner or anything, but like I'm pretty good at them. And there were a few of the later levels in this one that gave me a run for my money. It gets pretty tough. It's got that old school NES difficulty that's got you gripping your controller and clenching your teeth a little bit. So yeah,
it reminds describing the want for a more open style of gameplay where the player gets to choose what they do at what time. I think some games do this really well, like you said, that they do it better than others, where the difficulty doesn't feel so flat the whole time that literally you just go anywhere because it doesn't make any difference. But games like the Souls games, or like even Elden Ring, I don't know if any of you have played Elden Ring.
I'm too scared to play Elden Ring.
I got like 30 minutes and I hated it.
Oh my gosh. I loved Elden Ring. You're allowed
I'll
to
try
not
again.
love it.
Yeah.
I loved Elden Ring, but something I really appreciated about the open player choice style of it is it's extremely difficult. But if you get good at the mechanics, if you figure out the mechanics, you can really encounter the world at whatever rate and pace you want. So you can just like travel and plow straight through towards the end game right off the bat if you want. Although you don't have any upgrades and you haven't collected armor and all the weapons and all of these other abilities, but you really don't need to if you're really good with the gameplay mechanics. And there's something that's really satisfying to me about that, like watching Panzer Paladin gameplay, like just knowing that it's really about you mastering the gameplay. And even though you said, Eric, like you can upgrade your health and you gather different weapons with different abilities, it seems like if you get really proficient with the gameplay, it really is player choice. Like you can encounter this however you want.
Before people come at me, the game is really good. I never got good.
Elden Ring,
so
to be specific.
It's Elden Ring, so it's a personal fault that I didn't like the game.
Yeah,
It's
I haven't tried Elden Ring.
You should feel good about yourself. It's still a good game, but it's me that is a bad person for not liking it.
You're not a bad person. I know a lot of people who didn't love Elden. I loved it, but it's an acquired taste, I think.
Yeah, I'm scared to try. I beat Dark Souls 1 and 3, and I got most of the way through Demon Souls, and then I just got too busy. So I can do FromSoft games. I'm not a legend or anything, but like Elden Ring scares me. It's such a huge time investment, and it's such a consistently
huge.
difficult game that I'm like, I don't know if I've got it in me to commit to something like that.
Well,
the
nature of a sad dad game is like I just need something on rails so I can feel like I accomplished something, and not I can't just like sit down and not accomplish something if I only have an hour every few days.
Elden Ring would be really punishing for that. It's not as satisfying where that's concerned.
Yeah, I can't
Not
just
much of a minute
sacrifice an
to
hour
minute.
and not accomplish something.
No. Although once you've put in a lot of time to Elden Ring, what's satisfying is you keep like you there's a good new game plus mode where it progressively gets harder and harder. I played through Elden Ring the first time and I explored every single inch of the map and I tried to collect every single weapon, not realizing, because at a certain point I realized, oh, I'm super overpowered. I have all these weapons and all this armor for every situation. That New Game Plus was so much harder, and the New Game Plus 2, 3, 4 was infinitely more difficult. I didn't realize that. So when I started New Game Plus, I realized, oh, I shouldn't have just spent all my time in the first one doing everything because there was so much more to do. And the difficulty really ramped up. So I tying this back into Panzer Paladin, like the end game levels, are they like so difficult that you really need to spend a lot of time like prepping for them, or is it something that you can go straight into after just, like an average gameplay player? You don't have to spend a bunch of time grinding or anything, right?
No, it's not a very grindy. I think that I started the cluster of like end game levels and I wasn't quite prepared, and so I went back and I replayed the first level like once so that I could have more healing weapons. And then I went back and I did it again. So there's no grinding really. And if you're better at games than I am, which you probably are, you'll be just fine. Yeah. But so Panzer Paladin, super, super rewarding gameplay. We're going to talk a little bit about the visuals and sound now. Luke touched on it a little bit earlier, but visuals are top notch. They are very much retro inspired, like an old school Nintendo Entertainment System. They use a lot of blacks and they use a very similar color palette to the old school NES games with pretty stark color limitations. So like your character sprite is pretty much just orange. Blaze is orange with like a little bit of blue. And so they stick to these really tight color palettes. And I like that a lot. The way they use color in this game is really, really great. There's your characters are primarily orange. Enemies are primarily greenish. And then backgrounds, like the background levels stick to not a super rigid color palette, but they're maybe more limited than some games might be. It's very clear that the artists used restraint in the colors that they chose so that the backgrounds would be stark and contrast well with the characters and the enemies. And I think that's a super interesting, fun way to use color. And so I really, really enjoy the visuals in this game. It feels like an old NES game with some slight modern touches.
Super NES. I mean, it's giving me vibes of all my favorite old games. Like It's giving me Battletoad platforming vibes. It's kind of giving me, like I mentioned, Power Rangers, very Mega Man vibes, and maybe the color palette as well that brings out a lot of that. Like, but I mean Metroid. But it gives me a lot of those really nostalgic vibes. It looks like it'll scratch that itch.
It really does. I love retro games. I love games inspired by retro games, and Panzer Paladin is right up my alley as far as that goes. All right, and then so audio as well. Audio is really great. It's lots of crunchy, 8-bit kind of sound effects, and the soundtrack for this game is really, really great. So they got Power Glove to come on and do the theme song for this game. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Power Glove, but they are a metal rock band that does covers of like video game music and nerd things, and they did the theme song for Panzer Paladin, and as the kids say, it slaps.
It slaps
great.
so hard. It's so hard.
It's really great, like 80s guitar riffs and like it's like a power ballad kind of, not really a power ballad, but it feels kind of like an 80s action movie, like guitar riff. It's really, really great.
I've long been a fan of Power Glove.
Yeah.
I've loved
Same.
Power Glove, and I've
They're
long
great.
been a big fan of theirs. I mean, shout out to big covers of theirs they've done, like the Pokemon theme song,
Yep.
and Power Rangers and X-Men, and they've made some rockin' hardcore geek soundtracks that are great to listen to.
They've done a couple of Kirby songs too that
And
were
Kirby,
surprisingly hardcore. Really great.
Their Zelda cover is really hardcore. I mean, so Power Glove rocks. They rock.
Yeah.
Big fan of theirs, and so pumped that they did Panzer Paladin because
Yeah.
that's very much the aesthetic for this kind of game that I want to hear.
Yes, and I do want to say that Panzer Paladin either helped or completely composed the theme song, but all of the tracks for the game were composed by Patrice. I need to practice pronouncing these names before I start, because Bourgeau, I think, is how you say your last name, Patrice Bourgeau.
Crushed it.
And the soundtrack is really solid. It's got a great like old school vibe to it, chiptune kind of a thing. It reminds me a little bit of a slightly less punchy Shovel Knight soundtrack, but it's really, really great. So I want to give her credit as well. Power Glove is amazing, but Patrice, you also knocked it out of the park with the rest of the soundtrack too.
You did it, Patrice.
You did it, Patrice. Way to be. Yeah, so moving on, I want to talk about a couple extra things that I loved. There is an extra mode in this game that seems like it was made specifically for me. And I love it so much. And I am so excited. There's a forge mode in this game, you guys. And what it is it's a drawing tool. It is a pixel editor where you can go in and you can draw your own weapons. And so you can get your pixel art, which I love pixel art. It's a new passion of mine. I really love making pixel art. So you can go in and make your own weapons, and you can assign different attributes to them. And they're like special weapons that will drop at certain points and levels. When you beat like the mid-level boss, you get a special weapon. But if you've created your own weapons, it'll give you one of the ones that you've created. And so obviously I went in and I made the Master Sword, and I made the Beam Sword from Halo, and I made the Buster Sword from Final Fantasy. And that's like, as soon as I didn't even play the game, I like bought the game, and before I started playing, I made like 10 different swords because I was so excited to make my own swords.
Could I make a bunch of like Castle Crasher weapons?
You could
make
whatever you want,
golden
as long as you
hammer
can
and-
draw it. Yeah. Oh, also I made the shovel from Shovel Knight, obviously.
Obviously.
So are there any constraints to it, or does it just give you like a grid for you to draw in?
It's just a grid, and there you get 3 colors, I think, because it needs to match the color sprite of your character. So you get like orange and then a white highlight and then black. And then, yeah, obviously you can't make it huge, like the whole screen. There's like a grid that it has to fit within that certain space. But it is a mode that they didn't have to include. The game would have been super great without it. But I've spent almost as much time drawing pixel weapons as I have just playing the game. It's my favorite, and I love it. And every game should have a tool that lets you make your own weapons. It's the best idea ever. And that's all I've got to say about that.
Are there other games that let you build? I mean, outside of modding, like the modding community is a completely different thing in modding games. But are there other games you know of that do this? Like, I can't think of retro games that let you do this.
I can't think of a lot of retro games. Games like Scribblenauts or Drawn to Life for the DS. There was a few like DS games that were really big about that because, stylus and touchscreen and stuff. But it's not a super common feature. I remember like Mario Kart on the DS let you make a little insignia that would be on your cart while you drove. And so there have been some games that have like a little bit, but off the top of my head, this is one of the only ones I can think of that's like, yeah, make your own weapon, do whatever you want with it. And I love it so much.
That's such a great idea.
It really is. Every game should do it. Every game should do it.
Yeah. If I want my weapon to be like just a fish and I want to fight through the whole game with my fish weapon, I should be able to do that.
Exactly. Should be able to do that.
Should be able to do that.
Yeah. So any closing thoughts about Panzer Paladin before we close it off here?
It looks and sounds exactly like my childhood. I mean, it's the type of game that I could easily lose myself in nostalgia for. It has the perfect vibe for that old school retro platforming type game, and I love the aesthetic. 90s kids, I feel like, would really just fall for this game.
100%.
I don't know that I understand the juxtaposition of lore with like these Gundam robots and these dragons. And do they explain that at all, or do they just go for it?
They explained it a little, but they mostly just go for it. It's just I think that, and
So
I
it's just
appreciate
80s style cartoons.
it's just 80s style. It's like, well, because you're playing an NES game, and it's just like, oh, and then there's this weird thing that has no context and makes no sense, and like it goes a step above that. It explains things a little bit about kind of what's happening, but for the most part, it's just like, yeah, go fight a dragon. Here's a huge snow monster. You just fight it, like, and here's a Wendigo. Kill it with swords, like.
I guess for me, I guess that it's like Power Rangers.
Yeah,
you don't there doesn't have to be a reason. And
yeah, the reason is because it's cool.
Give them plaudits for that. It's just cool.
I think that we need more things in the world that exist because it's cool.
Because
why did you do this? Because it's cool. I don't need more reasons.
Don't question it. It's awesome.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap it up here. Playtime for Panzer Paladin is about 6 to 8 hours, but they also have a remixed mode, which is all of the same levels, but a little bit harder and with different enemy placements and stuff like that. So if you want to do that, it just about doubles your playtime, which I think is great. And that one the last levels on that one are they are tough. They are not kind. And I might just be bad at games, but they're pretty difficult.
New Game Plus, see, it is like platforming Elden Ring.
Exactly. So it's not exactly like a New Game Plus. It's like a remixed mode of the normal one, but very, very much like a New Game Plus. But yeah, and then it's available on Windows, Nintendo Switch, PS4, and Xbox One, and it is $19.99, which is just the right price, I think. It's a bargain. Every game that I talk about on here is a bargain because I have excellent taste and all these games are great and you should buy all of them.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Remember that you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, make sure to give us a thumbs up and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear what you think and we'd love to talk with you in the comments. And I think that's it. I was going to say something else.
Really
I forgot what it
petered
was.
Out there at the end.
I really petered out. I like to end on as weekly as possible. I feel like that's the most satisfying for people to listen to is for me to just kind of like slowly
Guess if you
stop.
got to the end.
People love to listen to podcasts with low energy.
Yeah, that's what I found. So I'm going to go take a nap. See y'all later. All right, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. This is another episode of Eric's Indie Corner. We really enjoyed talking with you today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Outro. Bleepity doof, bleepity bloopity blow.